So James is also the author of a book called Content-Based Networking. I don't know if anybody has read that book yet. If you haven't, it is fantastic. I absolutely recommend it. I listened to it. I love most of the content that books that I read. I listen to podcasts, but fantastic book. I love. You're also the voice of that audiobook. And an incredible listen, a fast listen too, but very insightful. One of the things I loved about the book is that not only are you talking about the principles, but it's also the tactical implementation of how to do it, examples, and talk about metrics, things to be tracking. But just a great book. And also, if some of you have heard of the B2B Growth podcast, if you haven't heard of that podcast, I absolutely recommend that you start listening now. There's already, how many episodes are there now?
I think it's like almost 2,500 almost. We've been doing it since like 2016. So
yes, that is a lot of episodes. But they are fantastic. And I started, and we'll get a little bit deeper into this, but that's how I ended up finding you, so the B2B Growth podcast. But an absolutely fantastic podcast, top 100 multiple times in Apple Podcasts, over 4 million downloads, also a contributor to Entrepreneur Media and HuffPost. And I didn't include a lot of your other backstory here, but just a incredible, deep, awesome background. We won't go too much because we want to get into the real content of today's discussion. But anything else you want to throw out and a kind of intro to yourself?
I think the thing that one thing that I'm really excited about in 2022 is the creator economy, and I've just been observing the creator economy kind of from afar for probably, 6 months to a year. So probably a little bit late to the game. But last year we started a podcast called Young Married Christian, where we started flying in a lot of Christian influencers into Orlando, and we started just like filming content with them. And I've just learned a lot about like the nuances of like what makes a creator a great creator and what allows them to build audience in ways that companies wish they could build audience, but they don't quite have. Like there's a couple key skill sets. So anyway, so that's top of mind for me right now.
Cool.
And so if that ends up coming up later in the conversation, we can definitely touch on that. But something I've been really passionate about. Yeah,
and I have some questions for you regarding commodity content later. Yeah. It's something that you've been hyping on LinkedIn. For those who are not connected with James or other people from the Sweetfish media group, if you're not connected on LinkedIn, you absolutely should be. They're putting out some really fantastic, helpful, insightful content, especially for marketers, regardless if you're B2B or B2C, B2G, whatever. If you're in the marketing, sales, customer experience, absolutely amazing podcast and LinkedIn content. So definitely connect with James. Look him up on LinkedIn, get connected with him. James, today I want to dive deep in first starting with the content-based networking, talking about what that is, some insights on how it fits into marketing mix, and how it's used for building relationship. And note for a second, it doesn't say content-based marketing. That's not just what we're talking about. Content, and it's intentional, it's specific, because it is much more than just marketing. And there is a lot of use and a lot of power in a marketing mix, which we'll talk about. But it is much more than marketing, which I know that there are people here who are not just on marketing teams or in the marketing profession. So this is for you too. Anyway, we'll get into it here. James, let's just kind of go to the basics for a second. Tell us a little bit about, just kind of higher level view, what is content-based networking?
Yeah, so content-based networking essentially is reverse engineering relationships with the exact people that you want to know. So if you're a startup looking to build relationships with investors, if you're maybe a little bit later in your growth journey and you're trying to hire people, if you are a B2B company trying to connect with your next best customer, whatever relationship you're trying to build, content-based networking essentially is a way to reverse engineer building those relationships in a one-to-one fashion. So, by doing content collaborations. So instead of, like in the early days of Sweetfish, when we, didn't have two pennies to rub together, I couldn't afford to run paid media. I get anxiety thinking about cold calling and trying to just like sell somebody on doing a podcast when they have no idea who I am. So I was like, how can I build meaningful relationships with people, and through those relationships, then hopefully, they'll find out what we do, and we can ultimately work together. And so I just started asking people to be on our podcast, to be on B2B Growth. And sure enough, whenever you ask somebody to be a guest on your show, it's super flattering, and they end up saying yes, and you end up building these really powerful relationships. It doesn't need to be a podcast. You could do it for your blog. You could do it for a video series, any type of content it works on. But that's in essence, that's what content-based networking is reverse engineering relationships through content collaboration.
And what's interesting on how our relationship began was you doing content-based networking with other people,
Yeah.
and then audience listening, and then so I was almost as like the kind of a secondary intent, if you will, where the focus is the building the relationships piece. Yes, putting out great content for the podcast, but the probably the main focus for that particular episode wasn't so that you could connect with Pete Larkin,
Yeah.
right? So how it kind of started is I was listening to the podcast. At the end of your podcast, you had your cell phone. You put your cell phone number and you said, text me. Anyway, so I reached out to you on LinkedIn. We got connected there. And then I ended up scheduling an appointment through your website to meet with somebody. Yeah. But yeah, just listening to the podcast, I wanted to learn more about what you did because I had some interest in doing a podcast of our own. And then I found your book. I read your book, listened to it. It was fantastic. And then I ended up, here we are. Now we're in, what is it, almost a year into our relationship, me being a client of Sweetfish. And our podcast is really starting to kill it. And specifically, and I'll share some of my thoughts on this a little bit later, on the relationship building and how it's working for us. And Brandon here from my team is on one of the main, kind of producers of that podcast. We call it the ITAM Executive. I'm in the software asset management space, or IT asset management. It's a pretty niche industry, which most people have never heard of. I had never heard of it when I started with this company. But basically, we help really large companies manage their software environments. And I didn't even know it was an industry. Didn't even know it was a thing. And so this podcast, there's no real podcast in our industry. And so I thought, man, like this kind of a space that's not really, like there's opportunity here. There's nobody really doing a good job at this. There was one podcast that sucks. And I was trying to be nice about it. So I really feel
if you're here, I'm sorry.
It was just like super dry, boring content. And like I started listening to a couple episodes and I just was like ears bleeding. So I was like, okay, we could do way better at this. I'll come back to some of the experiences that we've had at Angle Point in building those relationships with the likes of Walmart, for example, right now, Starbucks. I'll share some of those examples in a minute, but tell us a little bit more about some of the examples of content-based networking applied. You talked a little bit about kind of in the early stages. Tell us a little bit more about kind of what that looks like, the process of doing that.
So it first starts by getting a lot of clarity around who you're trying to serve. And so for us with B2B Growth, we knew that B2B marketers were who we wanted to build relationships with. And the mistake that I see a lot of people making whenever they start to do content-based networking is they want to make the show about themselves. And so they want to make it about what they do and who they are. But the problem with that is when you go to start reaching out to the people that you actually want to connect with, whether it's an ideal buyer or whoever, if they don't share your same like industry expertise, so if we were to start a show about B2B podcasting, which is our expertise, we couldn't have reached out to Pete or other ideal buyers to be a guest on a show about B2B podcasting because they don't know anything about B2B podcasting. And so that kind of it was pretty intuitive, or I was pretty like I understood that pretty early on, but I see that being a constant mistake that companies make. They're like, oh, like we're an SEO firm, and so we want to do a podcast about SEO. Well, that's great if your strategy is something else. Like if you want to build an audience and you want to become known as the SEO experts to the masses, that's awesome. It's going to take you a while to build up an audience. Because it's very competitive. There's lots of people in the SEO space. But instead, if you get really clear on your buyer persona and make the show about them, so it's like, I'm an SEO firm, but I want to serve Utah, like small businesses in this area. You would brand the show, it would be more of like a local, like where you're highlighting stories of companies in this particular area in Utah. And by doing that, you're making the show not about your expertise, but about the people you're trying to build relationships with. And they actually will say yes to being on a show when they don't feel like they're going to be an idiot whenever you're interviewing them. Because if you ask somebody who knows nothing about SEO to be a guest on SEO experts, they're obviously going to tell you no. So that's one little like facet of content-based networking that I think you guys have done really well. Is like it's making it about IT asset management. Like you guys play in that category and you do work in that category, but there's the people that you're trying to do business with also know a lot about the industry. And so when you're asking your ideal buyers to be a guest on the show, they actually have something to say. They have a point of view that they can share.
Yeah, so just kind of repeating back, one of the important things you mentioned here is identifying the ideal person that you want to connect with, and also like who the audience for the show is.
Yep.
Right. And also
they're usually the same thing. Like
Yeah.
you're trying, like the audience is the type of people that you're trying to be a guest of
Right.
the show as well.
Yeah. And that was really important when we were kind of taking this approach with our podcast. Is we're in ITAM services, we're not going to create a podcast about ITAM services, because then we end up teaching our competitors how to do our job. What we really want to do is to be speaking with the buyers, right, the people that we want to sell to, and highlighting them and help, putting them in the limelight and on a pedestal and saying, hey, like this person has a lot. And I think you'll find that almost everybody who has some sort of expertise or experience in their industry has something insightful to share. That's one of the things I want to talk with you about, James, is, and well, actually, we'll come to this in a second. It's just like, how do you get that great content out of somebody else? So let's come to that in a minute. But another thing that you had mentioned here is kind of the difference between creating content for your audience versus creating content with your audience, right? And that's one of the main premises of content-based networking. And you correct me if I miss anything. And this is what I love about it is, with content-based networking, I'm not just going to create content for people, right? We still do that, and there's still a lot of value in that. But when you get to create content with the people that content is intended for, right, for the audience, they get to be part of that process. And during that entire process, you're building a relationship with those people, right? Like you had said this. You had said it's people feel flattered when you invite them to a podcast. I absolutely can attest to that, because when we invite people to be on the ITAM Executive Podcast, they absolutely feel like it's a compliment, right? They're like, oh, you want to talk to me on your podcast? Thank you for inviting me. And I have never had anybody that I've personally asked say no. Never once have I had somebody say, no, I don't want to be on your podcast. So that's the thing I want to talk about next. Tell me a little bit about when it comes to sales development and networking, this kind of networking premise. How do you use content-based networking to start some of those discussions with people?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons you have such a good response rate, Pete, is, just knowing you, is you're very like complimentary, you're very encouraging, and you're not afraid to tell somebody why you want them to be on your show. So that's one of the things that we are trying to get better and better at Sweetfish is as we do this on behalf of our clients, how can we communicate the why behind someone being on the show? So as you are trying to figure out like, okay, I really want this person to be on my podcast, do some digging, like figure out like, okay, they wrote a book or they have their own podcast or their company just did this really cool campaign. Figure out a reason why you want them to be on your show. Mention that in your outreach, and the likelihood of them saying yes is going to go through the roof, as opposed to just some generic like, hey, I saw you on LinkedIn, want to be a guest on my show? It leaves people feeling really confused and like, is this real? Like this seems like a message you could have sent to 400 people. Make it personal, and I think you're going to be very pleasantly surprised with who you get to respond to you.
I love this because this is both the kind of the principles we're talking about, but also the tactical implementation.
Yep.
Like this is the how to do it, right?
Yep.
So when you're reaching out, this is a little example from our reach out. Is I see somebody and I say, hey, there are two types of people that I like to invite onto the show. And there are actually multiple, but some of my favorites is one with the intent to build a relationship with them because I want to sell into that account. I want to sell into that company. But then there's the other side where they may be an industry thought leader or someone with a lot of experience that I might not necessarily want to build or sell into that account, but I do want to build a relationship with them. I want to be friends with them. Even to a point where we'll interview, and we've done this, we've interviewed competitors in our space, albeit to be fully transparent, not necessarily major competitors that we feel threatened by, but definitely people who are considered to be competitors. But as we meet with them and spend time with them, we build the relationship with them. But the reason I also like bringing them in is because they do have a lot of really great insights to share. And so our audience, when they're listening to that podcast, like they get a lot of benefit from that podcast, right? Yep. So yes, I'm building relationship, maybe building partner. We do this with our partners as well. Greg right here is from my team as well. Greg has just set up a podcast episode with one of our partners. And we've also done this with a major SaaS provider in our space where they have some really great insights to share, but it's great to build partnerships, right? So we love doing that, the co-branded opportunity there. Yep. I want to talk a little bit outside of podcasts. Like, how do you do this? Because a lot of people here be like, great, you guys are talking about podcasts. I don't want to do a podcast, or I'm not going to do a podcast. How do people do this with when it's not podcast content?
Yeah, so I did this. I built relationships with about 30 CMOs when I was writing for Huffington Post. So you can do it if you're writing for a publication. You can do it if you're writing for your own blog. So doing roundup articles where you go to the people that you want to connect with, and you're like, hey, I'm writing an article about XYZ. I'd love to jump on a 15-minute call to have you contribute some of your thoughts and ideas to it. So you can do it with written content, you can do it with video content, you can obviously do it with podcast content. I think podcast content is probably the easiest because it's an audio medium, and so just jumping on a call and talking, ripping the audio out and putting it onto an RSS feed, like it's pretty simple, and it's very conversational. But one of the things you mentioned, Pete, earlier that I want to make sure we touch on is something that we call POV discovery. So I talked about points of view earlier, and one of the things that makes your content good is does this content have a strong point of view, or is it just saying the same old crap that all of your competitors are saying or that everybody else in the industry already knows? And so a few ways that we go about building really strong POVs for each of the episodes that we produce, we try to do a pre-interview. So it's helpful in two ways. One, it helps the content get better because you're planning it out better, but it also gives you some additional relational equity with the guests that you're reaching out to. So when you first reach out, instead of just saying, hey, let's come on and record the episode, say, hey, let's jump on for a 15 or 20 minute pre-interview so we can talk through your points of view and figure out what angle we want to go with the episode. And then you jump on again a week or so later to do the actual filming of the episode, and you'll find that that second interaction with somebody is where the magic happens. Like you'll notice, like right when you jump onto Riverside or Zoom or wherever you're recording, like you've already had an engagement with this person. You already know this person. They already trust you because of that pre-interview. And so the friendship is already starting to happen. And so I love pre-interviews for those two reasons. But during the pre-interview, there are some questions that you can ask. I'll share 3 specific questions that you can ask to try to get to the heart of someone's point of view. The first one that I love is, what is a commonly held belief about your industry or what you do that you passionately disagree with? So what's a commonly held belief related to your work that you passionately disagree with? And so the phrasing of that question is really important, because most people have something that it's like, man, everybody is saying this, but I believe this. One thing I found with that question is sometimes you might need to send it to them before actually jumping on the call, because a lot of times it's a big question, and so it can be a little bit overwhelming. So if you send it to them ahead of time, they'll have some time to think about it, and they'll have a much more kind of polished or a much better response. So that's one little caveat there. These other 2 questions, though, I have found get a pretty good response even if you don't give them a heads up. And it's essentially, it's kind of the same question, just with a little bit of a twist. What's something that everyone in our industry should start doing today that they are not already doing? Or the opposite of that, what's something that everybody in our industry should stop doing today that they are doing but is detrimental to what they're doing? So the start and stop question and then the commonly held belief question are great POV discovery questions. And once you hear their responses, you can ask them all 3 of those questions in the pre-interview, and you as the host can make the determination of like, okay, this angle, I haven't heard anybody talk about this before on the show. And so you as the journalist get to decide like, okay, this is the angle we want to go. But that's helped us develop much stronger points of view for our guests, which ultimately helps them sound way smarter to our audience, and ultimately gets them more affinity with our brand, because who doesn't want to sound smarter on a podcast episode?
I do. Now, I love this, and it's tried and true, right? And I can tell it's tried and true. One, you guys have done a lot of experimenting, fine-tuning to get to those main questions. Yep. And I've tried it, and that's what we do. We follow that framework, and it definitely works. And while we do that POV interview, I go through, and I'm taking notes of what they're saying, and I'm kind of seeing like what the outline becomes for the podcast, right? And I'll be, while they're talking, I'll write down questions of things that I want to ask, or things that I want to touch on during the podcast. So it prepares me as much as it prepares them. Yep. While we're building a relationship, and also especially for those who do work with sales or customer success, you're learning about what their pain points are. Yep. Right? What are the things that I can help you with? What are some of your struggles? You learn those things without having to ask those things. Right? Which I love that. Okay, we're going to I'm going to put you on the spot more than we already are. I was not planning on this, and I didn't tell you about this. We're going to do a little kind of role play for a minute. First off, who here does any type of podcasting? 2 people? Okay, 3. How many have any type of blog or articles that they write? Okay, a couple more. What other type of content? I'm just curious, what other types of content do people create? Vlogs, maybe? Video content? What's that? Newsletters? Okay, email? Awesome. Okay, let's do, what's that?
Online courses.
Online courses. Awesome. These are great. So a lot of these are pretty common in content marketing, a lot of different channels. There were more hands that I saw for blogs, so let's do a blog. Let's say, James, you have a blog, and you want to build a relationship with me, a potential prospect, and you're going to apply the principles of content-based networking using your blog. So let's, regardless of, I'm just going to play along and kind of riff off of you. How do you start?
So I would first start by figuring out what is it about you that makes you ideal for me to build a relationship with. So is it because you're at a company that has at 100 plus employees? Is it because of the role that you're in at your company? Is it because of the industry that you're in? Like, what is it? And get really clear for myself, like, what is it about Pete that makes me want to connect with him? I think a lot of people go into this and they just kind of take a haphazard approach to who they're trying to build relationships with. And I think one of the reasons we've been successful with content-based networking at Sweetfish is because from the get, we've been we pivoted into it, but we are very specific with who we ask to be on the show. So we ask folks that are at 50 plus employees, usually between 50 and 500 employees. We want somebody that is usually a VP level marketer at their company. And we usually like to go after folks that are SaaS companies. So SaaS tends to be more progressive in their marketing, and they are much more friendly to the idea of doing a podcast than a lot of other industries. And so VP level marketer, they're an in-house marketer, so they're not at an agency. They're at a company, typically a SaaS company, usually 50 to 500 employees. So that's our sweet spot. So now that I know, like, okay, these are the types of people I'm going to ask to be on your show. The reason this is important is because when you get down the road a little bit, people start pitching you to be on your show, which is awesome, because now we have a lot of our ideal buyers that are actually coming to us, and their PR firm is trying to get their marketing leader to be a guest on our show. And I'm like, sure, I'll interview your VP of marketing.
Hey, I'm a thought leader. Can I be on your show?
But by having that clarity, you are able to say no to the people that aren't a fit, as opposed to just saying yes to everybody and not making as good of a use of your time as you potentially could be. So that's one reason.
If I can touch on just really quick, these are some account-based marketing principles for those who are familiar with ABM. This is kind of the idea of your ICP or your ideal customer profile. If you haven't read a book called ABM is B2B by Sangram, I always mess up his last name. Vajre, thank you. I apologize. Fantastic book, but a lot of great principles which also apply in this scenario too. So, sorry, keep going.
Yep. So once you're really clear on that, where were we going next?
So we're going to do this now that we've identified me as somebody that you want to build a relationship with.
Yep.
We're going to do a real role play where you're going to reach out to me.
Yep.
However you're going to do it for this example.
So I would start
Let's
to
do it for real.
Yeah. So I would start to do a little bit of research on like what is what's Angle Point doing? So I might go to their LinkedIn company page and see what they're posting. I might Google around to see if they've been mentioned in the press. I might see that they've got a new office that they're building in Salt Lake City. And so I do my research. I figure out, like, okay, what's noteworthy that Angle Point or that Pete is doing that I could then go to Pete and say, hey, I noticed that the last campaign that you guys ran, because he's a B2B marketer, our show is for marketers. So speaking to a campaign that he's done is particularly useful for our show, because our listeners are going to be interested in what an in-house marketer is doing to move the needle in their own marketing. So I would reach out to Pete and say, hey, Pete, loved this last campaign that you guys did. I saw it on your blog. Would you be up for coming on B2B Growth to talk about it? And 9.9 times out of 10, he's going to respond and say he's flattered, and we're going to schedule a pre-interview.
Yeah, and I mean, in this scenario, pretending that you don't have a podcast, that you have a blog, and you want me to co-write with you, right?
Yep.
So you reach out to me with that, with that approach. You've done your research. You've identified me as somebody who you actually want to build a relationship that makes sense. It's not just like, oh, that person's cool, I want to talk to them. Yep. That is a potential buyer that fits your ICP probably. You reach out to me. You send me a message. Invite me to co-write on your blog.
The way I would go, I would not even say co-write, because that feels like a lot of friction and it feels like a lot of work that Pete would have to do to like co-write something with me. So I would say, hey, do you mind if we jump on a quick 15 or 20 minute call so I can interview you for a blog post that I'm writing? Got it. And so him being able to jump on, that's why I like podcasting so much, because it's it's just having a conversation. But if you'd rather do it in the context of a blog, that's how you could play it.
Yeah, I'd love to feature you on our blog.
Yep.
Would love to interview you to share some of your insights.
Yep.
And what's great about is because again, after that interaction that we have, and you may reach out to me on LinkedIn, you may email me, whatever it is. You may, if you have my number, call me,
Yep.
text me. I respond to say, yeah, let's do this. And then you can go through, depending on, if it's a POV with a podcast or similar for interview type style for a blog in this situation. But what are the next steps? And how do you continue to build out the relationship with them post content that you've worked together on?
So this is something that we have been thinking about a lot for about the past year, and I know that you guys have started doing this as well. But one of the ways that we found to continue to develop relationships with people that you've collaborated with on content is to put together little 10-person mastermind groups for all of the guests that you feature on your show or that you do content collaborations with, because they tend to look very similar. So for us, it's all in-house VP level B2B marketing leaders at companies with 50 to 500 employees. And so on the heels of the interview, usually when the interview goes live, we'll reach back out and say, hey, we're putting together what we call marketing squads. You guys are calling them SAM circles, is that right? So branding some sort of mastermind type group where you're saying, hey, I want to invite you into this monthly 1-hour call where it's just us facilitating a conversation with you and your peers. So if Pete knows that he's going to every month get to chop it up with 9 other VPs of marketing at other SaaS companies that are about in the same growth stage that his company's in, it's really intriguing. It's valuable for him to want to be a part of that group. Plus, it allows us, the facilitator of those conversations, to continue to deepen those relationships, to get to know Pete more, to get to understand our buyer persona a lot more, because now we're facilitating multiple groups and we're hearing all of our ideal buyers talk about what their pains are, what they're excited about, what they're thinking about, what's top of mind for them. And so it's been extremely helpful for us. I'll share one example that I shared with Pete yesterday. So we had a woman that was at a really large company. I think they were they might have been Fortune 100. And we usually don't serve companies that size, but we brought her into this marketing squad. She loved it. We had a very unfortunate experience where her grandfather went into hospice while she was in one of these groups. And so she couldn't show up to one of the groups, so she messaged us. She was like, hey, my grandpa's not really doing well. So we ended up sending flowers to the hospice room where her family was all gathering. And we ended up sending the flowers shortly before her grandfather passed away. And so she ended up messaging us afterwards, just telling her how much that meant for those flowers to come in that particular moment. And we would have never had an opportunity to have that kind of interaction with her outside of these groups, and having a reason to every month connect and engage with the people that we want to be connecting and engaging with, and really developing actual friendships and actual relationships with. I share that because a few months later, she was in the process of leaving that company to go work somewhere else. And she had started the process of hiring Sweetfish to run a podcast for that company. And she ended up staying at the company, I think, 2 or 3 weeks longer than she would have, just to get the deal across the line, because she knew if she left, there was a chance that they would end up not signing the contract with Sweetfish. But because of the affinity and the friendship that she had with us, the individuals at our company, she helped push that deal along for us. And that's, I think, the power of building really meaningful relationships. We could have never foreseen in a million years that circumstance playing out the way that it did. We didn't send flowers so that we could close a deal with her 2 months later, but we wanted to be her friend. We wanted to care for her well in a really crappy situation. And I think through the content collaboration process, through putting together these kind of micro community groups, you get an at-bat to be a real human and build genuine friendships. And I'm just convinced that business is a whole lot more fun when you're doing it with friends and you're making a lot of friends in the process.
I love this, and a great example that I've had of this recently, and this was when we first kind of got our podcast up and rolling, and I really still didn't know what the heck I was doing. I'm still figuring it out. I'm so grateful that Brandon's here with me, and Greg, because I'm still figuring it out. But during one of the first interviews, we were trying to figure out who are we going to have come on the show. And I remember reaching out to a gal named Kim Kimisakas. It's not how it's pronounced. I don't know how to say it perfectly. You can tell I'm terrible with names. I know faces. Anyhow, so Kim invited her to be on the show, and it was very quick. She was like, "Yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it." And so we jumped on a call. We had the pre-interview, the POV discovery call. Went really great. I took notes, and I had kind of the outline for what the interview was going to be. I felt really good about it. And then we got the podcast live into production. And mind you, I had never met this gal ever before, never talked with her really ever before. And then after that podcast, one of the things that we didn't touch on is making the content that you've created together, making that really easy for people to share. And maybe if we have time, we'll touch a little bit on that. But I sent her the podcast and I said, "Hey, this is the rough draft. Is there anything that you might want to change or edit about this?" I've actually since stopped doing that. But in this instance, as I was learning, it was a great another touch point for us to connect. But now, just after that one, I guess two interactions. One with the pre-interview and then the actual podcast. We connect on LinkedIn and engage on each other's content all the time. She either likes, and I know it's not, vanity metrics here, right? But she either likes or comments on almost every post that I put out. And I also engage with her content. But we also, in the comments, kind of going back and forth where, and I've also had, since then, I've had a couple of interactions with her over email. But I guarantee you, if we were to see each other at an event, she would come give me a hug. And she'd be like, "Pete," and I'd be like, "Kim," like, "Hey, what's up? How are you doing?" Right? And so building friendships, I would say that our friendship between Kim and I is blossoming and growing. But talking about relationships, it is a fantastic method of building not just being able to network and connect with people, but building friendships with people.
I don't think we use the word friendship enough in business. Yeah. I'm on a little mini mission to solve that, because I just think we spend 90,000 hours of our life at work, and I desperately don't want anybody's 90,000 hours to suck. And I think whenever you're working with customers and a team that you are legitimately friends with and pursuing friendship with, it makes those 90,000 hours awesome.
Absolutely. And I would say yesterday was the first time that we met in person, and with a hug.
Yep.
Right. And first time I met you was the first time I met your wife and your son.
Yep.
And we went to dinner together, had a great time, and you met my wife.
Yep.
But even before that, I would call us friends.
Yep.
And now friends IRL, right,
Yeah.
in real life. And the last presentation we had with Ethan Butte, it was the first time that I had met him, also greeted with a hug, and I considered him a friend.
Yep.
And I'm telling you, the power of LinkedIn when done right, and this is what I would say, if you're not making friends, not just connections,
Yeah.
if you're not making friends on LinkedIn, it is my opinion, you're not doing it right.
Yep, I would agree.
And there's opportunity to do it a lot better.
Yep, I would wholeheartedly agree. I think so many people are, I don't even want to say misusing. They're not leveraging the platform in the way that they could be to build those types of friendships. And a lot of it comes down to they're not engaging with other people's content. And so make a hit list of 5 to 10 people that you're interested in the work they're doing, or you want to learn from them, and every day just make it a point to go on and comment and engage with those people's content. And I guarantee you, after doing that for a month or two, there's nobody else that's going to be that consistent commenting on their stuff. Like, you're going to start to build those really cool relationships.
There are metrics that are important for tracking and helpful. Like, you can look at likes, you can look at comments, you can look at engagements. But now one of my favorite metrics, and I don't know if I call it necessarily metric, you could, but kind of the goal and objective for me is, how many friends am I making? And I'm talking real friends. How many friends am I making? Yep. And all those other metrics are just kind of supporting vanity metrics that get you there, right? Yep. But if you don't have, like, I would recommend this. If you don't have a goal to make a new friend or say a couple friends on LinkedIn this year, I would definitely recommend making that a goal. Real legitimate friends where you would go out for dinner with if they were to come into town.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep. It's changed my life. I mean, it really has.
We're at about 12:47. I want to give some time for Q&A. Is there anything before we jump into Q&A that you kind of want to close off with?
No, I think we've touched on a lot of it. We talked about POV discovery. We talked about the kind of micro community stuff. Curious to hear if y'all have any questions.
Cool.
I got a really good question, because I've never really posted much on LinkedIn, but I have noticed in the last year the biggest trend, there's 2 trends on LinkedIn that are really big. Everyone's seen this: poll questions.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, because those are just popping up
everywhere. Yep.
Now, great opportunities for content, great opportunities for hitting your goals. I've never done any of it, but I decided to do one poll question, and my goal was to get calendar invites, because I thought, why not? Let's see where this goes.
Yeah.
Just poll questions could be just random, or they could actually lead to something.
Yep.
And I got 7 calendar.
Nice.
My only one poll question. Now, the way I figured it out, it's all in content-based marketing.
Yeah.
And the way you word your poll question. And I figured it out, and then I reached out to 7 or 10 of these first people that I'm, LinkedIn connected to, and I didn't even really know them. And I reached out and I said, hey, I think you're doing poll questions all wrong. Can we set up a calendar appointment and just talk about it? And sure enough, that led to more conversations and new connections at first. And now I want to do those events, those live events, saying, hey, you're doing poll questions all wrong. Come to our live.
Nice.
And I have a buddy who's helping me get that started. But I haven't yet started. Have you had any good experience with live events or poll questions?
I have not done any live events. I personally don't attend any of those, and so doing them myself when I know I personally don't attend any. I think it can be really good. I've been a part of other people's live events. And then polls, we have done a bit with polls. I think just like any new product on any platform, so like Instagram is always going to prioritize their new features, and so they're going to naturally like shine more of a spotlight on the creators that are using new features. I think polls is in this particular season of time that product for LinkedIn, where they're really heavily like pushing them in people's feeds because they want more people using that feature. I think that will evolve and that will change, but I think live events and polls are certainly those 2 things right now.
Yeah, and people, they see polls as kind of a hack to get more views or more attention. And it's because LinkedIn does give it more, the algorithm gives it more focus and gives it more views. However, you need to go back to the intent. Right,
Yep.
The purpose. I mean, I saw a poll the other day as what is your favorite color? And it's like, this is the poll.
We've started using polls to inform kind of how we consult our our customers. So for us being a podcast production agency, like if I do a poll that says like, where are you listening to your podcasts? Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, and maybe one or two other platforms. It was really enlightening for me to see pre-Spotify acquire Joe Rogan, most people were consuming their podcasts on Apple Podcasts. Post Joe Rogan getting acquired, it flipped. So now the majority of people are actually consuming their podcast content on Spotify, which ended up shaping like us figuring out like, okay, how do we put more emphasis for our customer shows on Spotify rather than Apple Podcasts now that Spotify does ratings, where Apple Podcasts used to be the only podcast platform that allowed for ratings. Now Spotify does as well. We were all over that because we knew most people are using. So that's how we're using polls. I'm sure there's a variety of different ways that you can use them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll be interested to see how much longer LinkedIn's going to be pushing polls.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are just getting tired of polls.
Yeah.
What else? Any other questions? What we got? Yeah. And tell us your name.
My name is Bracken. I'm Macri.
Bracken. Nice to meet you, man.
Yeah, so my question was, and maybe you don't have any experiences with this, but in your book, you're like, just start, just do
Yeah.
some content.
Yeah.
Have you had any experiences with people who have maybe reached out to an organization or found some audience base that isn't just starting from scratch, but like reaching out to some association that may not have a podcast or may not have a blog and say, I'd love to do your blog, I'd love to do your podcast. Have you ever seen that? Successful, not successful?
So reaching out to somebody not to say, hey, I want to create content with you, but hey, just cold pitching them basically?
Yeah, or just like, do you have any examples of people who instead of just starting from scratch with a podcast have been able to make a strategic partnership or kind of launch with a larger base instead of just going, or is it just, just start?
Yeah, I'm sure there could be really cool ways to do that. I'm trying to think of any examples right now off the top of my head. Does anything come to mind for you?
I mean, it also depends. Is this kind of coming from an individual or coming from a group or a company, right? Because with a company, depending on where you're at with your company, you may already have some sort of audience to build off of. You might have a newsletter audience. You may have, a LinkedIn audience, whatever. If it's an individual between your own network. But I absolutely think that there's opportunity for working with a partner who they may have some sort of audience to spring off of that you might not. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, you just have to figure out how do you make it valuable for them. So if they're bringing the audience, are you bringing the production chops? So are you like, hey, I want to do a show with you. You've obviously got a really cool audience. I've got the ability to produce this thing and create a bunch of ancillary content that we can post on social. So that's how I try to process a lot of these kinds of things, is like, what is going to make this valuable for them? So even with content-based networking, like when I'm asking someone to be on our show, how is this going to be valuable for them? Well, with B2B Growth, it's easy because it's a top 100 podcast, and so obviously they're going to get their ideas spread to a lot of people that they otherwise wouldn't have been spread to. But when we were first getting started and we had no audience, it was like, hey, this could actually be a really good piece of content for you to create that helps you get your next job, or that gets you promoted at work because you're going to post this on LinkedIn and your boss is going to see it. And, oh man, like I didn't know Pete had such good ideas around this stuff. So like trying to think through what is going to make it valuable for the other person. And that's where I don't really like the cold pitching. Like we've done some outbound at Sweetfish and we've reached out and like, hey, have you ever thought about doing a podcast? It just never ends up getting nearly the kind of traction that we get whenever we do the hard work of actually like the relationship building. And I haven't found any better way to build relationships with people than by collaborating with them on content.
One of the things I also wanted to mention that we haven't had a chance to chat on is the opportunity for bridging gaps between sales and marketing,
Yeah.
and working with your SDR team. This is something that we are actively working on trying to improve with our salespeople and help them catch the vision and we have had at least one salesperson reach out to us and say, hey, I want to talk to this person. Can you look into doing a podcast with them? Right. I had mentioned earlier Starbucks and Walmart, both people that we want to sell into, and we identified which would be the right people in those companies for us to interview, and we reached out to them, and both of them have expressed interest in coming onto the podcast. But when the sales team, when they figure out like, oh man, like this is a tool. Right? This is a real opportunity to help me get in somewhere and build relationships with people. When they can see the value, and that's what we're still working on trying to sell internally, when they can see the value of it, because we have case studies like it works for us. Now we need it to work for other people in our company. But when they see that, man, you also get a lot more clout, a lot more support, and a lot more backing from your salespeople.
I think we're just conditioned to think that when we think about how can we add value to someone, we only think about the thing that we do that makes us money. And so like I can add value to people in a lot of different ways other than just producing their podcast for them. Producing their podcast for them is how we make a living and how I make a living personally. But what are, like, thinking outside the box and thinking, how else could I add value to this person independently or in a completely different way than how I make my dollars? Because if I can add value to them in other ways, they're likely going to want to, they're going to want to work with me in the way that, you know, where I actually, how I make a living. So, but I think that gums people up a little bit, and I think it's easy to only think about adding value. It's like, well, of course I add value. Like our service is the best service in the world. But when you lead with that, it doesn't come across like you're trying to add value. It comes across like you're trying to sell something, and so and people sniff through that from a mile away. And so I think just like, to me, like the big aha whenever we first started doing content-based networking, before it had a name or before we even started Sweetfish, it was just trying to reverse engineer, how can I add value to this person in a way that's completely independent of how they could potentially pay me.
I love that. All right, we're running out of time. Any other questions as we close up? Yeah, Greg, and then, so you were first. Sorry, Greg.
Just a quick one. You mentioned that you might hit on how to make the content very easy to share and the importance of that.
Yeah. So there's lots of tools now. I mean, Canva is a really helpful tool for that. There's a tool called Descript where you can make like little micro videos. So if you're recording your podcast episode on Zoom or Riverside, whatever platform you're using, just loading that content into Descript and making 3 or 4 different like micro videos. I have not found that like quote graphics work as well as like standalone pieces of content. I think they could work to like supplement a blog post. So you put in like a headline graphic or a quote graphic inside of your blog post. Micro videos work really well. What other kind of micro content have you guys been playing with?
Yeah, and I love this because actually Rex, when he was at OpenSense,
Yep.
he invited me to be on their podcast. I was on their podcast, the Growth Camp.
Yep.
Is that
Growth marketing.
Growth
campaign,
marketing.
Yeah.
I was on their podcast, and then and now Rex from OpenSense now works for
Yep.
you. So Rex, when I was on his podcast afterwards, he sent me an email, and in the email it had 5 or 6 different types of content that I could share. There was a graphic that he said that, and the email was very, warm, very kind, that just said, hey, we want to make this easy for you. If any of these fits, your type of or style of LinkedIn posting, please feel free to use any of this. Hopefully it helps. So there was an image, there was a link to a video, there was a just like a sample kind of ghost written LinkedIn post, and then all of the links to all of the major podcast hosting companies, right, or platforms, that is. And so he just made it so easy for me that I was like, oh, copy, LinkedIn, paste. Done, right?
Yep.
And that's kind of like one way to do that. Because they may or may not share something. They typically will because they feel flattered of being on the podcast. They want to share it with other people.
You have to make it easy, though.
But make it easy. Yeah.
Also, coming from you makes them look like they're not just shooting their own phone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yep.
Exactly.
Put it on their page, it doesn't look like, hey, look at me, I'm so awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet.
Yep. Greg, you had a question.
Yeah, question. Oftentimes as marketers, we're like, hammered to like get the results. What's the cost per lead?
Yeah.
And I feel like, while I agree with a lot of this, it is very much it can be a long play.
Yeah.
So if you have any tips for, selling the value of what you're doing to management who may not be able to see dollars spent to immediately dollars created?
Yeah, so we used to talk about this a lot. I went in the early years of Sweetfish, I had this conversation a lot, and it was essentially like I would just ask, like, and you as the marketer, you probably know this information already, but like, what is the deal size of an average customer, and what is the profit to the organization from that deal? And so in a lot of B2B companies, it's oftentimes $100,000 plus. And so being able to like put those dollars in perspective of your management to say, okay, we're going to spend whatever, $50,000 producing a show that's going to allow us to build relationships with, if you do a weekly show, 52 of our ideal buyers. Do we think that we can get one of these people to map to revenue for us? I think we can. I think we could probably get closer to 5 to 7. There's your return on the investment. Like, so it's basically content production that pays for itself because we're producing it with the exact people that we can do business with. So that's how I would frame it, is like getting clear with like, one customer for us is worth X. This is how much it's going to cost to produce this content. We only need one of these content collaborators to turn into revenue for us to justify and offset the cost of all of the content that we're going to produce for the entire year.
It's funny when I was trying to sell my CEO on the podcast idea, it took a bit of convincing.
Yeah.
I kind of put a little pitch together, and afterwards, when he gave me the green light, he sent me an email after the paper was signed, and he said, "Congrats, you bought a podcast." And then later in a meeting, he said, "I get what you're trying to do. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't really know if it's going to end up working out for you." And now, no, I didn't tell you this.
No.
We recently were on a call with Gartner, and we were doing a briefing. And Gartner, one of the main analysts who's over the Gartner Magic Quadrant for our space, if anyone's familiar with Magic Quadrants, he told us during that briefing, he told us that he's been listening to the podcast. So this is a Gartner, this is a top leader in our particular space from Gartner who does the Magic Quadrant, who's listening to our podcast, and he evaluates our company and our branding and our marketing. That's part of the Magic Quadrant. I don't know if you know that.
No.
So part of how they evaluate a company is like, what is your reach? What is your impact? What's your involvement? There's so much that goes into those. It's stupid crazy how much goes into those. But part of it is that they weigh you. It's a low weight, but it is part of how they weigh you is what is your marketing program like and your sales program. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he called out the podcast, my CEO, like sitting there, like listening to Gartner talk about our podcast, like that was a big win.
Yeah.
Right. And like later on, he came to me and he was like, "I didn't think this was going to work, but like, it's doing something at least." So we still have, we're still working on really being able to show the revenue dollars from it. Our typical sales cycle is 8 to 9 months in our sales cycle. So we still have, some time before we really expect.
Do you have some dollars in the pipeline though that you can attribute to they were a guest on your show?
Currently right now we don't. No, but we have a lot of people that we've been meeting with, and I say a lot. That's subjective. We have people from the podcast that we meet with that we're really pumped about, that we're building relationship with, and we do have, I think, 1 or 2 opportunities that are currently in the pipeline, but we don't have anything actually sold from it.
Yeah.
I have no concerns at all that we're going to.
Yeah.
And when we do, with the size of dollars of our accounts, I'm not like, it'll pay for itself
For the
tenfold.
next 10 years,
10 years, yeah.
It's wild.
Anyway, great question. Anything else? Una más.
You gave the best line where you said what people do in your industry that people think that you're doing might be incorrect. I had to get that from your wife. I could say this, I could remember. Just say that one line again.
It's the passion I disagree with.
Oh, what's a commonly held belief that you passionately disagree with? So it's a POV discovery question that you can ask to try to figure out an angle for somebody's content. Is that what you're referring to?
And then the other one of what?
Yeah.
what
What's something that everybody in our industry should start doing? Or what's something that everybody in our industry should stop doing? The start and stop question, and what's a commonly held belief that you passionately disagree with? Those are goodies.
Okay. All right, guys, we're going to close it up. Let's give it a round of applause here for James.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.